Arie Farnam is an American journalist and novelist living in Bohemia in the Czech Republic. She is currently working on a series of dystopian fantasy thriller books that have garnered a lot of spectacular 5-star reviews. But these aren't your average fantasy dystopian books. They are very intense and way more emotional. So, Arie Farnam, I heard that you were a journalist before you were a grant writer, and now you're a writer. So what's your actual profession?
Well, I mean, I guess all of my different jobs, including actually teaching at different points, had to do with writing and putting words together. So I would say I put words together with a purpose.
What did you write about when you were a journalist, though?
That was, 15 years ago, and I came mostly over to Europe, to Central Europe from the U.S. to write about. I wanted to write about social justice issues and the big politics of the region. I ended up originally actually writing about mostly kind of small tourism issues. Then I got to have the environment beat, and that was pretty fun. And I got to have, I actually covered transportation issues for a while. Then I got a string with a U.S. newspaper, and so I was able to go to places like the Balkans, and I wrote about conflict in Kosovo and Macedonia. I wrote about all different kinds of issues across Central and Eastern Europe, from NATO conferences to going down in the illegal coal mines in the eastern Ukraine.
Wow, so you did a lot of really dangerous things. So how objective do you think the media is today?
Well, just as it was then, the media isn't. I don't see the media as being particularly objective. There's a lot of problems with different kinds of biases. There's personal biases of different journalists or editors. There's the biases of the different organizations, the different media companies, whether it's from the owners or from the stockholders, people who have an invested interest in it. There's also just social biases, whatever society we come from has different biases. And one of the things that I see a lot with the international media or the U.S. media has to do with what we portray as normal. At one point you were telling me about this problem where models are, a lot of models are actually anorexic, and yet they're held up to show women that this is how you should look. The problem is that it's impossible for most women, for most body types, to achieve that goal without being basically sick and in significant health danger. Another kind of thing happens where, especially when it comes to the U.S., whether it's the international media talking about the U.S. or it's the media inside the U.S., there's this image that's made of like what the real American is. They live in the suburbs with these big, wide, curvy streets. And they have a 2-car garage, and they have this big house, and they have big cars, and it's multiple cars. And the problems that they have, yes, they have problems, but they're saving for their children's college fund, and they're doing this, and they're going on vacation, they're doing all this. Well, actually, that economic level is not what the average American is living. And I was looking at these numbers where MIT was calculating how much a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 kids, how much do they really need to get by? Well, the federal poverty level is about $24,000 a year. And they were calculating you need about $45,000 a year to actually cover your basic needs: shelter, food, clothing, to a level where you're not going to be having a social problem for living in poverty.
Is that with putting something in savings? Or
No, that's not with putting something in savings, exactly. This is the problem, So, but they also calculate you need to add about 30% to that. That would be just, $45,000 a year. That would be just basically covering the basics. But it wouldn't be taking into account that you can have medical emergencies that aren't always covered by the health insurance. You can have all kinds of different things that come up. So they say you need to add 30% to make you stable, so that you're not going to be in significant danger of falling into poverty. So then we're talking more like $55,000 to $60,000 a year. And that's without saving for college funds. It's even without big vacations and things like that. It's without putting some money aside for retirement.
Yeah.
So they're basically saying a family of 4 to have that kind of standard of living, the one with the 2-car garages and living in the suburbs, that we see on TV all the time, portrayed as, in movies and stuff, that's portrayed as, they're not real rich, maybe they're actually kind of considered the poor people in the movies.
Yeah.
And
the normal people.
Yeah, the normal people.
Yeah.
So you've got the young kid who's not real rich and he's in love with the girl who's really rich, but he actually comes from what most of us would actually look at and see as
rich,
as being wealthy.
Of course.
So and they need about $100,000 a year for a family of 4 to live at that, to basically get by at that level. And the mean, which is actually higher than the average, is currently around $52,000 a year.
Wow. So that's not even enough to be getting by safely.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah. That's not even enough.
Just
and that's not the average. The average is the average is actually higher. But the mean, which is halfway through, 50% of the people make have less than the mean. 50% of the people have more than the mean. The average is a little bit higher because the wealthier people are so wealthy that they pull the average higher. But in any event,
of course.
Still, that's I'm not necessarily complaining here. I'm not giving a lecture on social inequity. We could get to that another time. But this is about the media and how the media portrays, even just in films. It's not even, reporting. This is the way it's portrayed, is that
so
this is what you're supposed to compare yourself to.
Isn't very objective.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah. It's not particularly objective in that. That's simply a social bias. It's not even. Nobody is telling the directors, the film directors, or the journalists, or anybody that this is what they should present.
Yeah. So if the media isn't objective, who's calling the shots? Do you think?
Well, that's a good. That's a good question. There's a lot. There are different theories. There's Noam Chomsky. Has written several books on this, and I've read them as a good journalist should. I've read a lot of other books, but I like the theory of filters, which is basically there's several different information goes through different filters. It goes through your social filter, which is what we've been talking about, showing what your society thinks. It goes through the personal filters of what a journalist, for instance, personally thinks. That influences it to some extent, even though the journalist tries to be objective. We can't help but having some influence. Then there's, the owners or the stockholders of the media organizations. There's also the viewers. What the viewers, put their feedback to the news organization of what they like. There's sources. If you want to cover something, you have to be able to get officials to talk to you. And if you're being too controversial, a lot of times they're not going to. That things do tend to go in a certain direction, and it has to do with the way the society is structured and the different filters that the information has to go through.
So when you were a journalist, were there things that you knew that you couldn't write because you might lose your job for writing that?
There were a lot of things that I wanted to write that I couldn't write for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes they were just considered not interesting. I really wanted to write about public transportation. I mean, for one thing, I was legally blind, and for me, public transportation meant the difference between being completely dependent and unable to have a professional job and having professional freedom and professional ability. And I saw the difference between the U.S., where there was very little public transportation, and Europe, where I could basically go anywhere I wanted to, anytime I wanted to. And I saw it as made a big difference for anyone who doesn't drive a lot. If you don't have a lot of money, it really has a tendency to make the inequity in society less, because it takes out one of the big hurdles that people who don't have a lot of money, younger people and older people especially, have to being part of the active society.
So I wanted just wasn't interested in reading about this?
Well, to some extent. To some extent, it was considered a non-issue in the U.S. To some extent, obviously, it was not really a good idea to try to make an unfavorable comparison between the U.S. and Europe. I was
saying that Europe is better in this?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I was reporting from Europe. If I was doing that, writing to a U.S. organization, I would be basically comparing the U.S. and Europe in some way, and the comparison wouldn't be entirely favorable. The same way with healthcare. I wanted to write about healthcare because I really, growing up without a lot of money in the U.S., the healthcare that I saw in Europe was far superior to anything that I got in the U.S., and including specialists in eye issues and stuff, which is interesting to me because I was visually impaired. But in dentistry, I mean, and things like that. So we had been told we had believed in the U.S. and been told, and the media presented this picture that European healthcare is this socialist system where patients die while waiting in long lines for care, and this was not what I found.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to write about those kinds of issues, and they generally weren't acceptable for one reason or another. Either it was just kind of a non-issue, it wasn't interesting enough, or there was actually these problems where making an unfavorable comparison was a problem. And I was also just so overwhelmed by all the things I could report. If I looked, I was looking at ethnic conflicts. I was looking at all kinds of things that were really important.
Would get even more publicity.
Well, they were getting more publicity, but I was allowed to report those things, and those things were not bad. They were important things to report too. So you had certain things that you wanted to report, but there was only so many hours in the day or in the week, and so I generally, I was always, I wish I could report on that, but I didn't have, I could only do a certain amount. But then when I look back at my catalog of all the things I reported, I go, oh dear, I have contributed to this American view of the rest of the world that they're, less advanced than us, that they're always having these conflicts, that, and it's a very different view of the rest of the world than you get when you live in other places. Well, in Europe, I've lived in Africa, I've lived in Asia, I've lived in South America, and in many different places, it doesn't fit with what you really experience. And yet, my own reporting, if you take the aggregate of all the things I reported on, that's the impression you would get from the rest of the world. Because whether I wanted to or not, because I reported on the stories that my editors wanted, that happened, what they were mostly about was conflict and those kinds of things. If there was something that was more positive, it was something cute, Czech cart farmers and their 1,000-year-old tradition, which was a great story, but still, it just wasn't, it wasn't the same kind of a thing, so.
So, did you ever have to write things that you knew to be untrue, though?
Well, there was one situation that I remember specifically. There may have been others, but there's one that I remember where I was reporting in Macedonia during the conflict in 2001, and I had to mention in an article the history of the region and the history of Kosovo, because the conflict was between the Albanians who were from Kosovo and the Macedonians in Macedonia, but it's right next to Kosovo. And so I had to mention the history of Kosovo, and I mentioned, something about the bombing of Kosovo and Serbia in 1999, where NATO, led by the U.S., bombed that area, and I mentioned very briefly the subsequent wave of Albanian refugees that streamed into Macedonia and into Albania. And my editors stopped me when I sent in the article and said, "You can't say that. You have to say that the refugees came first because that is the official reason that there was the bombing." And I said, "But if you look back at your newspaper, your own newspaper, the timeline that you of your own reporting shows that the bombing happened first. The refugees came later. Of the first reports." The bombing was on the 24th of March, 1999, and the first big reports of big refugees groups was on the 27th of March, 1999. So, and the interesting, and so in that particular case, I asked, can we just kind of change the article so that I don't have to use this reference? Can we, we leave it out? I can't put a false timeline under my name, and we agreed that in the future we would. Agree to avoid the issue. But I think in that particular case, it actually was reported that way in the end.
Why do you think they wanted to report it wrong like that?
Well, see, this was the interesting part, is that the editor didn't dispute the fact, and I really like this editor, you know, and we really saw eye to eye on most things, and she didn't dispute the fact that I was right. She just said, this is the way we have to write it. And I was a young reporter, so I didn't, you know, put the...
And she didn't even know why you're supposed to
I didn't put the grill on her, you know, why? Because I was a young reporter and I was really glad to have the job.
Yeah,
you know,
were just like, okay, what else your boat?
I was like, yeah, I really don't want to be like putting things under my byline that are, you know, true, and yet I didn't really... What I would say is there was a convention. It's called a media convention where just, not as an event, but a tradition where people had been reporting this and saying this, and it had been said so many times that even though you were right, you looked like you were wrong.
Yeah.
So
because
it looked
you're the
like
only
a
one that
mistake.
was saying that.
Yeah. Even though if people went back in the archives, all the media organizations had originally reported it correctly, but then it became conventional to report it incorrectly. Where that exactly came from, it probably did come from to some extent official,
like a mistake, somebody just like mixed it up, or do you think
I don't think so. That wouldn't, one mistake wouldn't do it because all the other journalists would know. But when you were a journalist and you were out in the Balkans, it was really important to have good relationships with the people who your sources, the same people who gave you your press pass, so you were an official journalist, were the U.S., you know, military or the NATO people, and they were the ones giving the press conferences, and they would say in their press, you know, statement, they would say something, for example, that said that, and then they would expect journalists, and some of them would report it that way because they weren't paying attention. Some would report it the other way, and they would get some, you know, a phone call later on, and it would become. I don't actually know how this happened, but I'm speculating that's the kind of thing that could have happened to make it become traditional. Or I guess theoretically somebody could have called up the top journalists of CNN and Reuters and this and said, okay, you know, that's a little conspiracy.
Report it like this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That wasn't the level that I was at, but and it wasn't the level even my editor was at. But it was a national publication. But and besides, we were 2 years on where it had been forgotten what was the reason for it. It was just that was the tradition.
But now you write fiction. Your books are a little bit of a genre misfit. What genre would you call it that you write?
Yeah. Well, you know, it doesn't fit into urban fantasy very well because it's not particularly urban. There's some scenes that are in cities, but there are also a lot that are out in the boondocks, and it doesn't necessarily fit in dystopia because most dystopia is in the future, you know. And some people have compared it to things like The Hunger Games or Divergent, but both of those are in the future. And
so your books are in the present then.
Yeah. So while it shares some plot and I don't know, atmospheric similarities with those, it's solidly contemporary. Everything that is outside of the fantasy elements and the actual plot looks like the world today, which, you know, people could say, so you're saying basically we live in dystopia? Well, the thing is that I certainly know we don't live in a utopia, given, you know, what I know of the way the media works and all kinds of other things. We don't live in a utopia. The what makes the series a dystopia rather than just life is rough in our day, in our real world, is that I was saying what if, which is how good speculative fiction starts, with some sort of what if question. My what if was, okay, all these different things. You were asking me about who calls the shots in media, and I'm trying to explain this complex theory, how these different, you know, influences come to make a similar thing, to make something go in the same direction. And it has to do with fashion, it has to do with anorexic models, and it has to do with politics. What if this was all much simpler? What if it was all explained by, there wasn't just all these different things that just happened to kind of become a confluence to lead in a certain direction, but what if there was actually a force that was driving all this, that was for its own benefit, that needed things to go this way, and that for whatever reason, the society, the way that it's built today, benefited this force or organization.
So some sort of God up there above all of the political.
I don't know. I don't know if
you say this, you do that.
It's not presented as a God. It's presented as there's a chicken or the egg type of a argument. They don't know, is the leaders of the association that created the force that they use to control things, or was that force like the force and it controlled the leaders who then controlled the other people? There's no one leader, there's no one bad guy in the series, which is,
well, that's a change.
yeah, that is
It's not
possibly
typical.
yeah, nobody has yet said that it's a plot problem, because there's always a certain villains that you run into in the story, but yeah, it's different in that way, that that's how basically the Adin got started. The idea of that was this what if question. What if the problems of our modern world could be explained? I created this theory, and I didn't even, think it all through until, as I started to think it through, I said, okay, this fits.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, everything fits. This could really be a good conspiracy theory, And so I do call it contemporary dystopia, and I call it a fantasy thriller, because it has elements of fantasy. It's not heavy on the fantasy, but there's elements of fantasy, and a reviewer called it fantasy thriller, and I decided that made sense because there are some very scary and intense parts, and basically if you don't like scary and intense parts,
it's not really for you. So what age group would you say that this is for, your books?
I've talked to groups of teenagers in the book clubs of 16 and 17-year-olds who liked it. It is very intense and scary, and sometimes I feel like younger people might have better things to read. Most of the people who really love it are in their 20s, But I've also had retired people read it who liked it, So,
really?
I'd say that the core age group is people in their 20s. People who are looking at the world. Most of the characters are in their 20s.
But really anybody can read it. Well,
But it does start, it starts with a 16-year-old girl. So
yeah.
I can see why people would think that it might be more for teenagers. She gets older. But, when part of it was that some of the premise of it I developed when I was about that age, so.
That's interesting. So some people call your book like a conspiracy fiction, and do you believe that there's a conspiracy to take over the world?
Well, there's a category called conspiracy fiction, like a genre, and actually, when I looked at the different categories, and I'd like to think that people who are into conspiracy things might find the books interesting, but it's true that lined up against the other conspiracy fiction books, the cover looks very different. It doesn't. They don't seem to be very emotional. They're all very much into technology, and almost everybody who writes them is a man. So maybe the last frontier of fiction that women haven't conquered. And so I don't know that it fits well enough into conspiracy fiction.
Just because of what the cover looks like?
Not just because of what the cover looks like. I actually haven't read tons of conspiracy fiction. I have read some, and I generally find it pretty interesting. I mean, it's usually on this what if.
Plausible,
yeah, it's kind of plausible, and
it's like your books.
And so. Do I think that there's a great conspiracy out to take over the world? Generally, I don't think that there is one specific conspiracy. I think that there are powerful groups that probably hold way more power than we would like. And I think that a lot of the interests tend to go in a similar direction. And people who, when you get to the top of politics, the issues that people vote about, the things that people think are important in politics actually aren't important, because what is most important is the goal of maintaining influence and authority and power in their political thing, and it's very similar to corporations, where their goals tend to be very similar. And so if there's a conspiracy, it's a conspiracy of intent, not a conspiracy of a specific organization or person.
So, do you think that there's anybody out there that's like secretly holding way more power than we even know of?
I think there probably are organizations that hold more power than we can imagine,
Mm-hmm.
but they probably aren't out there to destroy us because they actually live in the world too, and they.
Oh, yeah.
But what they actually would want would be, they would want to continue to keep their privileged position, whatever it is, whether it's influence or wealth.
Yeah, yeah.
And so often that just tends to have the influence that they tend to have happens to continue the status quo mostly.
Well,
I don't happen to be one of the people who thinks that there's aliens who want to take over the earth and things like
yeah,
that.
because that would make like how you were saying, like they live in this world too. So like
Mhm.
there could be like some aliens maybe out there like trying to control things that are going on.
I know that there's
They don't care 'cause
I
they
know
don't
there's
live here.
theories about that. I haven't studied them enough to really comment, but it's interesting. There is actually one point in one of the later books in the Kieran series where the people are some people are speculating about like the Adin, which is the theoretical, in this fantasy world, the people who are controlling things.
Mm-hmm.
And they do live in the world, and they're saying, how could even they be this unwise to be perpetuating things like climate change?
Mm-hmm.
It's got to come back and bite them too. And that I do think that in terms of the people who are involved in the top levels of politics and corporate economics, I am confused, simply confused about how they can continue to do business the way that they're doing it without realizing that it's going to come back and bite them too. And that's why.
Because they're keeping climate change a
Yeah.
secret, really, and
And
that it's
Yeah.
true.
And so a lot of times I draw parallels to
Uh-huh.
the real world in the books, and that's one of the ones where I don't actually answer that question to any satisfaction because,
Because you don't know.
I don't really know, so
Yeah.
in that fantasy world, theoretically, the desire for power and influence, which is forced upon those, they're basically under the influence of a psychic power of some kind that forces them to want power and influence and wealth above all else, and to want it for their organization. That drive is so strong, and it's an externally imposed drive on them that they just forget about things like climate change.
Well, maybe they're into the short-term gratification thing.
Maybe they're into the short-term gratification, but how can so many people in today's world, in the real world, be so into the short-term gratification, and they generally tend to be fairly educated people? How can they continue to do business as usual, knowing what the consequences will be? I don't know. To me, it seems like, okay, I could believe the Adin version better than reality in this particular case, because if they were controlled by something that was making them be, illogically interested in power and influence and wealth, then that would make more sense to me than the real world.
For sure.